That was the spring the bees disappeared. We didn't know where they'd gone or where they were going. They just weren't there anymore. We hadn't named the bees because we couldn't see them clearly enough to distinguish them from each other. So we referred to them in the collective. They bred, they swarmed, they made their honey for us in the collective. And they vanished collectively, as in a rapture. This was no less comforting than the other proposed explanations. Pesticide, fungus, mites, electromagnetism, even the infrasound the giant windmills make that sends the bats and raptors to their deaths. All invention gone awry, hive after hive suddenly empty, as if they'd flown out less than purposefully and somehow forgotten to come home. And what looked to us like a modest red house in the suburbs was really a ghost of the bees. A small ghost, a modest ghost, like the ghosts of the locust and the elms, not a ghost to trouble us. Until one day the house spread its wings and vanished, as houses do, or as houses did when the rapture extended to architecture, the god of bees and the god of small houses being one and the same. So that we were left sleeping alone again and out of doors in the spring. Once, the sweet water flowed over this land in a slow, shallow sheet that ran the whole way to the coast. The people before the Seminoles floated over the places where the palms grow now, between the cedar hammocks and the sharp blades of sawgrass, before bug spray and air conditioning. Before dredges stirred up the mud and spat out an endless number of waterfront lots. Before the bare, high banks and the resolute straightness of the canals. Then there were the people after the Seminoles. The blocks go on for miles. Downed palms line the road like carrion. There are rumors of grow houses and meth labs out here. Modern-day moonshiners. The empty roads have served as landing strips for planes from the south carrying clandestine cargo. It's an ideal place for recluses, for hiding. A refuge from the flamingos and the orange groves and the tourists.
Yep. You probably noticed.
Oh, I don't know what to do with myself.
Early on, lots were given away as prizes on game shows. Remote buyers were sold, sight unseen, over free cocktails and chicken dinners. In the dry season, chartered planes brought a steady stream of unsuspecting couples, met with offers of paradise on installment. The salesmen weren't so much selling the land as they were selling a dream with a piece of land attached to it. They were relentless. The buyers took their deeds home to the north and middle of the country, to long winters filled with work. They dreamed of warm retirements to pastel bungalows and long days of leisure on new land. When all the installments were paid, they owned the dream outright, and that sustained them, unless they tried to build on it. A security guard waits on the bridge, watching as trucks come in and out of the half-finished pump station. He's happy to talk. He explains how to get to the edible part of a cabbage palm, points out the hated Brazilian pepper, the hydrilla clogging the canal. He pulls out a small stack of panther pictures he's taken. He remembers watching the dredges as a boy, how the water rushed in and the berms were thick with snakes. It would have been the world's largest subdivision, a new city. The planners were the latest in a long line of latter-day alchemists, turning water into dry land. Years later, they were convicted of fraud. Now, the alchemists work in reverse. Pump stations will replicate the flow that once ran the whole way to the coast. Only this time, it'll stop at the highway. The engineers are re-establishing the dominion of the water, backfilling canals, drowning roads, erasing. The dreamers had to be tracked down one by one to rebuild the swamp. The government needed to buy back their dreams, sometimes their parents' dreams, 17,000 of them. Some didn't want to sell. The rawness of the physical wreckage is gone. In the quiet air, the place feels nearly rural. I imagine the sweet smells of wisteria and honeysuckle. I imagine I'm in a small southern town. But when I wave at an old man driving past in a beat-up pickup, he doesn't wave back. He just stares. I forget that proximity does not make us neighbors. Early on a Sunday morning, there is a work crew tending the grass lots. A neatly cut square neighbors a tangle of green. The mown edge demarcating intention, delineating care. The sound of the mowers is hopeful. The short grass, the promise of return. Before the storm came, the birds disappeared. When the water rose, the people crowded in attics until the water filled the attics. Some broke through to the rooftops with axes and hammers, and some did not. Houses floated like islands, people marooned on their shingled shores. water moccasins curled on the couches in their living rooms. The people waited for days, at first believing help would come soon, then realizing it might not come at all. The heat was stifling. The strange air of the hurricane turned sour with the smell of decay. When order came, it was tenuous. People were sent away from the sodden city, on buses and planes to be met by strangers, anywhere they were willing to receive them. Families were separated. It was not always clear who had survived. The houses were left crooked and ruined when the waters finally receded. Furniture perched in the trees and bodies lay still, waiting to be found like the photos of one family's Christmas and the spoons from another's kitchen. Years have passed. Many of the people have stayed gone. Some are still trying to get home. Because I've been there before, it isn't hard to find. There are no signs announcing it, but there are other clues. A sharp turn in the road where the highway was rerouted years ago. A hand-painted board that reads fire, with an arrow nailed to a bare tree. There is less smoke than there used to be. The burning has moved deeper underground. The hillsides don't glow red at night anymore. But it's burning all the same. If the state had put it out when it first started, the town would still exist. People say that. But the town is gone. Stories of taps that ran hot from both spigots, and flowers blooming in the middle of winter from the fire-warmed earth, have passed into memory, along with First Communions at St. Ignatius and Friday nights at the American Legion. An SUV pulls up beside me while I'm taking pictures. I think maybe they're stopping to tell me I need to leave. It feels like that kind of place. The kind of place maybe you shouldn't be. Instead, the driver leans out his window and asks me if this is Centralia. He says they'd been there years ago, but now they aren't sure this is it. They can't see anything. There's not really anything to see, I say. The heat of the fire was only a part of its danger. It altered the air. Carbon monoxide bloomed in basements. Furnaces would not stay lit. The big fire smothered the small ones, the benevolent ones. People feared they would asphyxiate in their sleep. Carbon monoxide detectors with alarms that sounded like the trill of a canary were distributed. But there weren't enough of them to go around. So some people started keeping real canaries. For them, silence was the alarm. Now, the empty lots are slowly reverting to woodland. Paradise trees aggressively claim open space. Honeysuckle runs in great unimpeded clumps. It's impossible to tell what was planted and what is wild. People return to scavenge what they can. A man with a metal detector, seeking unknown treasure. A woman cutting lilacs from an outsized bush. I wonder if the place where they grow used to be her yard. I wonder if she still thinks of them as hers. The initial buyouts were voluntary. Houses were torn down one by one after people chose to leave. Duplexes were cut in half and left to stand on their own as tall, skinny cottages with reinforcements like chimneys running up the once shared windowless walls. Eventually, the government invoked the power of eminent domain. Everyone was supposed to leave. The fire had burned for 30 years by then. Still, people stayed. Legally, they no longer owned their land or their houses. For all practical purposes, they were squatters in their own homes. Ownership is not only a legal term, though. For nearly a decade, one of the men who stayed spent his summer evenings mowing blocks worth of grass. A wide swath of the town's empty lots. An act of resistance through maintenance, holding the reclamation of nature at bay. He's gone now. The state forced him out last fall. He watched them tear his house down. The dogs return every summer. That's what the woman who sold the bracelet said. She said the Indians call them shade dogs because they lounge in the shade until a tourist shows up. Then the shade dogs show the tourists around. She called herself an Indian, the bracelet woman. She was probably Lakota, but she didn't tell me that. She didn't tell me her name either, and I didn't ask. She said that for years there had been 2 dogs who sat in the shade, and she didn't know where they went in the winter. But the previous summer, a white woman stopped by and liked one of the dogs so much that she put it in her car and drove off with it. The bracelet woman thought the dog was probably better off with the white woman anyhow. I bought a couple bracelets from her. I think she'd made them just that morning. They were woven from quill and tied with soft leather. Quill is what the Lakota used before the trappers showed up with glass beads. She told me her great aunt had taught her how to make them, so that she could support herself without a man. She was so good at it that it didn't take her long anymore. I asked her what she used to color the quills, expecting an answer about onion skin or hickory bark. But she said, "Oh, just Rit dye." That stuff you buy at the grocery store. If you drive west through the plains on the interstate, there are billboards offering free land to anyone willing to start a business and stay. Towns are drying up. The Lakotas have been trying to get their land back for years. The government has offered them money but refuses to return the land. The Lakotas want the land. If they wait long enough, they may get it back, because nobody else wants it anymore. We didn't know how to find it, and had no way to get there on our own. So we paid a local man to take us out in his minibus. It was about 7 miles from the closest town. He said he comes here every month or so, mostly at the request of visitors from the US. He didn't turn off the radio the whole time we were there, just sat with his shirt off, fanning himself in the humidity. In the pictures, they're in piles. Stained jeans, dark arms entwined. but everything that was left is disappeared now, absorbed back into the jungle. There are no placeholders. The wooden walkways, the pavilion, the sleeping cabins on stilts. Only memory marks the location. If we tried to find it all over again, I've wondered if we would end up somewhere entirely different. How exciting it all must have been at first. A small group set out to homestead on jungle frontiers. Young and strong and certain. They grew their own vegetables, built their own houses, raised their children together. For a long time, people still claimed you could find the vats where they'd mixed the poison. But if the vats are still there, they are thickly overgrown. The fruit trees they planted are there, though. They still yield fruit if you come at the right time of the year. The end was so thorough, even the animals in homemade cages were not spared. The only creatures that lived were those who escaped into the cover of the wilderness. There was one woman, though, who slept through it all. She was one of what they called their seniors. Her name was Hyacinth. She woke up the next morning, not so much alone as the only one living. The man who drove us out told us about an American who visits the place on a regular basis. He wants to build a marble monument with the names of everyone who died etched into it. Apparently it's been difficult, though. They never identified a lot of people. They're buried in a mass grave in California. There is a picture taken in the days after the end, before they moved anything or anyone, of two macaws preening on a fence above the bodies, a technicolor defiance of death's drabness. Hyacinth was awake by the time they took that picture. piles have been here for decades, unmoved like monuments. A measure of what is missing below the surface. A reminder of the earth's hollowness. They are what is left. The camps were only meant to last until the veins ran out. But the veins were deep, so the men stayed. Some eventually brought families, and the families stayed even after the wars ended and the work was gone. The families stayed. Connell Avenue is an easy throughway now, past open fields and overgrown lots. The last of the buildings still exist in street views on the internet. A gas station, a school, the secondhand store. Like ghosts. The only stop now is the pharmacy. The owner refuses to move. His customers come to fill their scripts from new homes in other towns, past closer pharmacies. A parking lot with bright white lines and unfaded asphalt suggests recent abandonment. It's a forensic exercise to figure out what the spaces were reserved for. A shiny turbine vent spins silently in the breeze atop the neat shingles of one of two standing houses. Shafts and adits flooded when the companies left town. Caverns filled with lifeless water that eventually finds its way to the surface. Local kids, when there were local kids, used to come home from swimming in mill ponds with odd sunburns. It was years later they realized the burns were from the water. The buyouts seemed arbitrary, as if the contamination was somehow contained by straight lines. On one side of the line the government stepped in, but an inch to the other side and there was no offer of rescue. Neighbors fell out with neighbors over whether the problem was the paint on old houses or the piles of old dust. They argued over property values. Some were indignant for the old folks. Some were indignant for the children. Some just didn't want to leave home. In the end, no one had to go, but once most everyone was gone, there was little reason to stay. The abandoned houses were torn down, roads were taken up, utilities turned off for good. A tornado came through town and there was no need to rebuild. Surrounding communities are struggling. Their past seems more vivid than the future. On the way from Tulsa, I pass a weathered hitchhiker sitting outside a gas station with a cardboard destination sign that seems to read nowhere. Turns out he's trying to get to Nowata, the next town to the west. As an outsider, it's easy to imagine other towns wishing for their own buyouts. There are so many kinds of disaster. But that doesn't account for the potency of homesickness, which is, in the end, a kind of love. And like all love, abstract to those who don't share it. There are curious signs here. Corn planted on condemned land. ATV tracks in the toxic piles. Dozens of bright beehives swarming with life on an abandoned lot. People aren't afraid of this land, even if they aren't living on it anymore. Last time I talked to my sister on the phone. We mostly talked about the school shooting that happened at Nickel Mines this week. We grew up close to there, just down Route 30 from Paradise. She still lives there, in Pennsylvania. She said she had seen one of the Amish women who'd lost her little girl talking to a reporter on the news a day or two after everything happened. The woman said she had already forgiven the man who'd done it. Some people think that the Amish generally oppose technology for its own sake. But really, they're just against anything that threatens the strength of their community, and they see a lot of technology as divisive. They can have telephones, for example, as long as they're at least 50 feet from the house. As long as they're inconvenient. I heard on the radio that when they buried the gunman, half of the mourners were Amish. even though he wasn't. They tore down the schoolhouse in the early morning hours when it was still dark to draw as little attention as possible to the place. There was blood everywhere inside. And as unfair as it seems, for such a thing to happen in a one-room schoolhouse full of boys in suspenders and girls too young to have to cover their heads, all the children of pacifists. Really, if there is any community that is prepared to weather it, it's the Amish. Because they make sacrifices every day in the name of community. And for them, it's in the name of God. But it's always seemed to me that ultimately, it's as much in the name of protection as anything, so that when they really need each other, their strength is assured. I guess God can mean a lot of things. I think about the mother of that little girl, the one my sister saw on the news, and I wonder for myself how I would ever make it through such loss. All I can figure is that we pay it one way or the other, either a little at a time or all at once.